It's been 45 years since the Kent State shooting, which, for people who aren't familiar with Kent State, it was basically a confrontation between Vietnam War protesters and the National Guard that turned deadly. On May 4th, 1970, 4 students were killed by the National Guard during these protests. These students, of course, were named Allison Krause, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Scheuer, and William Schroeder, killed by the National Guard troops. 9 other people were hurt. And as of today, Kent State every year tends to hold a commemoration of the shooting. So, obviously a big story in history when it comes to Kent State and the shootings that happened there. Ron, what do you have to say about this?
Well, you know what? It's weird that this kind of, I wouldn't say affects me on a personal level per se, but I know somebody that was good friends with my dad growing up. They grew up on the same street, whatever. They're still friends to this day. He at one point dated one of the four victims. I believe it was Allison. But I'm not, don't quote me on that. I think there were 2 females, right? So it had to have been one of them because he was dating a lady. But
right.
But I want to say it was Allison. And I've always wanted to talk to him a little bit about it, but there's just never been an opportune time to be like, hey, I always wanted to talk to you about this. It's kind of probably not like the easiest thing to bring up, right?
Sure.
And usually when I see the guy, it's at like holiday gatherings or something like that, so I've never had an opportune time to like bring it up with him. But one of these days I do want to just kind of talk to him about it. But
sure.
I think it's important. First of all, I like the fact that Kent State does something. I think that's very important because this was a very historical moment in terms of social unrest, in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of protesting, in terms of violence, in terms of police brutality or brutality of those in positions of power. Right. And I think the one thing that's a bit discouraging is you look at what's been going on recently in this crazy country of ours. And I think the argument could be made that we haven't learned very much. In fact, in some ways, maybe we've gone backwards.
I would tend to agree. The state of protest in America nowadays is, I think in my opinion, is quite sad. Here we are having so-called free speech zones. People in New York, when it comes to Occupy, if you can remember, people being caged in, lots of police presence, protecting banks and other places from protests. And just the whole idea in America that you get from a lot of people that protest is wrong. Shut up and take your place. It just seems, I'm going to throw it out there. It's un-American. Because what is more American than protesting? Our American history is founded on protest.
But we've lost a lot of those ideas. We've lost a lot. I think, I forget who it was, and I know sometimes I'm a bit willy-nilly with all my quotes, but I want to say it might have been Jefferson. Anyway, dissidence is the greatest form of patriotism. That's something that was a value of like some of the early thinkers of this country and so forth. A lot of that's been written out of history, and it's been replaced by this overly nationalistic, at times completely xenophobic idea of just like, we're America, we're proud. If you don't like it, just leave. Pa, 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 pa. Yeah. Like it's been replaced by that. And that's kind of this sentiment. So when you see a protest, or when you see somebody standing up for what they believe to not be just, I think, a lot of folks, not everybody, but kind of your general populace, they immediately turn off. And this also goes into what we've been talking about in terms of the media serving the corporate elite and not the general populace. Because the media, and it really started in the 60s with SDS and Vietnam protests later and stuff like that. The media has a very systematic way of responding to protests and social unrest. And it is the same thing, whether it's Baltimore, whether it was Ferguson, whether it was the NYPD, or whether it was Occupy. It doesn't have to be something related to police brutality. It doesn't matter the issue. They will trivialize the movement and pretend like it's not there. Then they will marginalize it. And the reason they do that, nothing threatens a status quo more than social unrest, than a group of people coming together and saying the status quo isn't working anymore. And when you have a media whose main concern is upholding the status quo, how do you expect them to treat a movement? How do you expect them to treat a protest? They're going to write it off. They're going to try to put it down. They're going to treat it as the enemy instead of treating it as, hey, we're here to tell a story. That's why I think that clip between Geraldo and that protester in Baltimore, that clip tells a million stories. And if anybody wants to know what's wrong with the media in the United States, all they need to do is watch that 2-minute clip.
So can you, you're talking about the clip. Give it some context. Explain exactly what happened during that exchange.
Well, I mean, basically what happened was Geraldo Rivera from Fox News was there, and there was a guy in Baltimore, a protester. I'm actually not even sure the gentleman's name, but he was confronting him and saying, you're not here to tell a story of what's going on. You're here to focus on the riots and the people that have resorted to violence. You're here, you have an agenda. Meanwhile, the media's obligation is to tell what's going on. And the guy pointed out, he's like, when we were doing our marches, you weren't here. Where there's tons of people protesting peacefully, you weren't here. You're not telling the story of the poverty our communities faced for years and years and years. You're not telling the story of the racism and the injustice we've been dealing with for years and years. You're not here to tell that story. You're here to serve your agenda. You're here to serve what your narrative is, which their narrative is, these people are undesirables, these people are others, and we're just going to sit here in the suburbs. That's the narrative that Fox News serves. This guy pointed that out, and he was confronting Geraldo, and Geraldo, of course, was completely brushing him off. And he was saying, "Oh, you're shouting." Yeah, he's talking loudly because guess what? The time to be quiet is long gone. And second of all, and I pointed this out in a clip that I did, Geraldo, or anyone from Fox News for that matter, to criticize someone for being loud or shouting, wow, if that's not pot meets kettle, I don't know what is.
Have they ever watched O'Reilly?
Yeah, right? Or anyone, Hannity, the list goes on and on. Just partisan hack puppets.
Yeah, and there's that really good point, too, of where was the media? The media, and I've said this before, the media doesn't go anywhere if there's no sensationalism, too. We live in a world of clickbait media, too. Not only does it serve a specific political agenda, but it also serves a business agenda. Riots get so many more, in instances of violence, get so many more hits, so much more attention than people who are peacefully protesting to air their actual grievances. And they have many. And so it's this sort of problem where the media goes and where the media doesn't go, and what happens when they actually get there. And what do they do? How do they paint the story? How do they present the narrative? And what narrative do they present? And those are some major issues facing our media today.
Yeah, well, and it's been going on for years. And yes, sensationalism is certainly part of it as well. The kind of clickbait, the if it bleeds, it leads. Of course, that's all part of it. But also, there's something deeper here where, yes, when it comes to a social protest or anything like that, the corporate media, now we're not including the independent sources when we say this stuff. I'm not including the Democracy Nows, the RTs, the Al Jazeera Americas. I mean, those are the ones you'll actually find out kind of what's going on. Or from, some of the vloggers out there like a Tim Pool or something like that. But I'm talking about, the corporate outlets. They have an agenda, even in many cases at the local level, when it comes to covering a protest or covering anything like that. I remember when I was in Pittsburgh doing my master's degree during a lot of the Occupy protests, and there was, Pittsburgh wasn't as big as New York or anything like that, but there was an Occupy presence there. And I remember one time I went there with my video camera just to see what would happen. And I noticed some of the more right-leaning outlets in town, which is basically all of them, and they were filming some of the Occupy movement, and it was very telling because on one side there was damage to some of the grass, like some of the grass in the park had died a little bit, and there were also a couple people that were dressed up as tents and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. On the other side, there were academics, there were war veterans, and there were people that had just gotten back from Iraq giving speeches and giving lectures. I'll give you one guess where all of the media was.
Yeah. I could definitely guess where their cameras were pointed.
Yeah, one place, Jeff. Mm-hmm. One place. Yeah,
like I said, there's a major problem with our media and the narrative that they have, the narrative that they try to write, especially when it comes to protest. And as I said, there's nothing more American than protest. We've been doing it ever since, our country started on protest.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the main things that fueled our country.
Yeah, and what's really sad is when you have an approach like this, which again has been going on for years and years, continues to get worse, and I don't see it changing anytime soon, that really hurts any type of social progress. It really does. It's incredibly stifling. It's a shame that when it comes to political protests, the media is a stifling factor. A factor that actually sends it backwards instead of fostering it. It's very sad and tragic. Of course it should be the opposite. Mm-hmm. It's a tragedy. It's a true tragedy. And I think in some ways you could even go as far as to say it's borderline criminal.
Mm-hmm. And that's what happens with the, corporatization of the media. They're no longer held as watchdogs of the government and instead become lapdogs of the government and the powerful and the elite. And certainly not for we the people.